Now, I think it's one of the most, if not the most, interesting what-if scenarios to ponder in all of Star Wars. One that raises all sorts of intriguing questions that range from what was the Chosen One really meant to do, or how was he meant to do it, to what would happen to characters like Padme, Dooku, Obi-Wan, and all the Jedi actually. Did they need to perish for there to be balance, or was there a different fate meant for them? And the scenario I'm of course talking about is what if Qui-Gon Jinn hadn't been killed by Darth Maul, but instead, what if he'd won and killed Maul in that duel? What would happen next? And before getting to it, let's clear up two things quick. First of all, Anakin was indeed the Chosen One and did ultimately bring balance to the Force by destroying the Sith at the end of Return of the Jedi. This has been confirmed by George Lucas himself. Second of all, though, yes, you could say everything worked out in the end. The Sith, as I just said, were destroyed and balance was brought to the Force. I believe it all happened in a very roundabout way that led to a great deal of unnecessary suffering for the galaxy, meaning I don't think events transpired as they could have or should have, or as the Force meant for them to happen exactly. I don't think Anakin was ever meant to fall to the dark side and become Vader, nor was the Empire supposed to rule the galaxy for a time being, or anything like that. Instead, everything that was meant to happen, or the way it was meant to happen, changed when Maul killed Qui-Gon Jinn. It's called Duel of the Fates for a reason. The fate of Anakin, and indeed the fate of the galaxy itself, was on the line, because Qui-Gon was supposed to be the one to find and train Anakin. That was the will of the Force, the destiny denied by the Sith that day, or in this case by Maul in particular. Okay, and all that said, and without further ado, let's jump right into it here and discuss what happens if Qui-Gon had defeated Maul. And do note that this is mainly going to be an overview, not so much a story per se, nor will I be going too much into detail with everything. And the first thing we'd have to address is, would the Jedi Council change their minds about letting Qui-Gon train Anakin? Because remember, originally they were against the idea because the code forbids Qui-Gon from taking on a second Padawan, and he was of course already teaching Obi-Wan. So in this alternate timeline, would they still knight Obi-Wan and let Qui-Gon then take on Anakin? And well, considering the Council did originally knight Obi-Wan anyway, in large part thanks to him defeating a Sith Lord, I'm going to say they would still knight him in this scenario, even if he wasn't the one to actually kill Maul. And this would happen thanks mostly to Qui-Gon advocating for this promotion, and speaking of how well he had control of the Force and his fear in their confrontation with the Sith. As for the Jedi Council letting Qui-Gon train Anakin, well, I think either way Qui-Gon is going to take and train him, and I think the Council very much knows that, which is another reason why they'd be willing to knight Obi-Wan to avoid any possible conflicts there. Some of them would certainly be less than pleased, but in the end they'd relent and let Qui-Gon train Anakin rather than see him break away from the Order altogether and take Anakin with him, because I think Qui-Gon would feel that strongly about all of this, strongly enough that he would do whatever he must to be the one to train Anakin. Either way here, all of this would help Qui-Gon see more than ever that the Jedi had lost their way, or were going down the wrong path, that, on the whole, they either no longer hear the will of the Force, or are choosing not to heed it, that they somehow don't see or aren't taking it as a sign that the Chosen One has come about, that things are dire and that the Force needs balancing, and that they might just be a part of the problem as well. And so, truly seeing the Jedi Order was losing its way, Qui-Gon would do all he could to keep Anakin away from the Order, to keep some distance there. But before discussing his training further, we have to look at what Palpatine's next move would be. We also have to keep in mind that he vowed to watch Anakin's career with great interest, and even with him under the tutelage of Qui-Gon, Palpatine would no doubt still be trying to keep his eye on young Anakin, and would likely be concerned that the potential Chosen One had come about and was being trained by a true old-school style Jedi, if you will. The problem for Palpatine is that Qui-Gon would do all he could to keep Anakin away from him as well, and I don't necessarily mean intentionally away from Palpatine in particular, but away from politics and the Republic in general. The last thing he'd want to see happen is Anakin and Palpatine become close, like they actually do. And even if Palpatine tried, I don't think he'd find it so easy to weasel his way into Anakin's life, with Qui-Gon in the picture, because Qui-Gon would likely be that father figure to Anakin that Obi-Wan couldn't be, and that Palpatine managed to fill for real. The other huge issue Palpatine would have is who would be his new apprentice after Maul, because in this scenario where Qui-Gon doesn't die, I have a hard time believing Dooku falls to the dark side and becomes a Sith. Yes, in the new canon, Dooku apparently leaves the Order before Qui-Gon's death, but I still like the idea that Dooku's departure stems from Qui-Gon's death, that it's almost like a last straw or a type of breaking point for him. And so in this scenario where Qui-Gon never dies, Dooku never leaves the Order, at least not to become a Sith, though I could see him essentially separate himself from the Order in an effort to join with and to help Qui-Gon Jinn train Anakin, because clearly Dooku is pretty disenfranchised with the Jedi as they are. Either way, this would be a huge loss for Palpatine. He'd no longer have Dooku as either an apprentice or someone who could lead the Separatists. Now sure, in both cases he could and would find someone else to fill those roles, and maybe two different people, but likely neither of them would be as well suited, or as good or as powerful as Dooku was. As for Obi-Wan, well, I don't think he goes with Qui-Gon and Dooku to train Anakin. I think some small level of resentment would have him side with the Jedi Council and just become a normal, full-fledged Jedi. In fact, in a fanfiction I did several years back now, where I, shall we say, embellished a bit on what would happen in a very similar scenario, I had him leave the Jedi Order to be with Satine before everything just sort of goes wrong for him, and that story was called Knights of the Forsaken Order, and if you have any interest in checking it out, I'll put a link in the comments and description below. Anyway, here, in all reality, I think, as I said, Obi-Wan gets knighted and stays with the Jedi Order and goes on to do quite well, as he originally did, eventually making his way to the rank of Master and a seat on the Council. And I'm sure he'd keep in touch with his old Master Qui-Gon. That resentment would fade soon enough, and it'd be interesting if the Council even asked him to do this, to in a way keep tabs on Qui-Gon and what he was doing with Anakin, and we certainly know doing something like that, making this type of request, is not above the Jedi Council. The years would then go by, and Anakin would of course be trained by Qui-Gon and or to some extent Dooku as well, while Qui-Gon would simultaneously continue his training to become a Force Ghost and likely share his knowledge on the subject with Dooku, and probably Anakin as well, since Force Ghost training is essentially making yourself the very epitome of a servant of the light side. Palpatine then, without Dooku, would continue to position his new and different pieces on the board and set up the coming Clone Wars, finding a charismatic leader for the Separatists, and finding someone to be his new apprentice. As for who exactly that would be, well, it could be Asajj Ventress perhaps, or he could find a way to single out and corrupt another Jedi. Pong Krell is a fun choice that comes to mind, but in both cases, he's not getting someone near the level of Dooku, he's settling for what he can find. Regardless, the splitting of the Republic would still occur, and an impending conflict between the two sides would loom, and during this lead-up, one of Palpatine's biggest concerns would no doubt be Anakin, that again the Chosen One was being trained and that it was happening well beyond his sight or his reach. Which would also mean, since they never get to know each other, that Palpatine wouldn't know about Anakin's infatuation with Padme. I'm assuming Anakin at some point in the real timeline mentioned her to Palpatine, if not talked about her all the time, which is why at the start of Attack of the Clones, Palpatine saw to it that the two were brought together as the first step in unbalancing Anakin emotionally and turning him to the dark side. Anyway, this time around, Palpatine would be oblivious to Anakin's feelings towards Padme, and that's assuming that he would still have such feelings for her, that being trained by Qui-Gon wouldn't help Anakin cope with and set aside those feelings much more efficiently, to the point where maybe he even puts her out of his mind altogether, though likely he'll still forever harbor a soft spot or a flame for her in his heart somewhere. Either way though, Palpatine never can use Padme against Anakin, and it's unlikely Padme and Anakin ever even encounter each other again, and even if they do at some point, there's little chance the two have any real time together or a chance to form that relationship, which they do in the real timeline. And so, in this timeline, they never fall in love and get married, and there never will be a Luke and Leia. This then leaves Anakin with only one weakness, or at least only one Palpatine knows about, and would likely attempt to exploit at some point, which would of course be Anakin's mother. And I'm going to assume that, since again Palpatine would not be able to get to know Anakin at all in this timeline, he'd be far more focused on killing him than trying to turn him to the dark side. Not that he wouldn't want to turn him, but with no way to get close to him, he may not even consider it a real option. And so I'd have to imagine the means here to use his mother against him would be very similar to the one that Palpatine actually used with Anakin's mother, since apparently it was Dooku that arranged for Shmi to be kidnapped by Tusken Raiders. Palpatine would once again arrange for Shmi to be kidnapped and held and tortured somewhere so that Anakin would feel it through the Force and want to go to her. Now, Qui-Gon and Dooku would likely try to convince him to let her go, that, as Yoda basically once told him in the other timeline, he has to let go of the things he fears to lose, which is his ultimate downfall. And I know this sounds harsh and that it'd be much easier for them all to just go and save Shmi and then hide her somewhere and forever put his mind at ease about his mother and allow him to also keep that promise he made to her, but they would not be willing to do that in order to teach Anakin this very crucial lesson. However, after years of training and likely being cooped up most of the time or being overprotected, Anakin would sneak off and go to her alone, springing Palpatine's trap, and where he'd end up having to face whoever Palpatine's apprentice is. And though this would be like a second duel of the fates, there's every chance the dark side or the Sith could prevail here, since we're basically discussing a best case scenario, or what the Force wanted to happen. Obviously Anakin would win this confrontation. Now, the two interesting questions would then be, would Anakin be able to save his mother, or would she still be killed? And also, would Palpatine's apprentice be killed by Anakin or escape? And actually, I don't think these two things would matter too much either way. If Shmi is saved, she'd likely be hidden somewhere then, as far away from the Sith as they could possibly get her, and Anakin would have his peace of mind finally. If she's killed, Anakin would have Qui-Gon to turn to, not Palpatine, who used her death as a form of manipulation, and I think he'd find resolve in his course of action now. His destiny as the Chosen One would become his focus, knowing the Sith had killed his mother, which I know is not the greatest motivation for a Jedi, but I very much think it would work in this case. As for Sidious's apprentice, if they're killed, that of course does put Palpatine in the difficult position of having to find yet another new one, and if they're not killed, well, Palpatine's likely going to be none too pleased with them and have very little faith in them. Either way, all around, no matter if Shmi and or Palpatine's apprentice lives or dies, this will be a huge loss for the Sith, because Anakin will have survived, and the Jedi, or at least Anakin, Qui-Gon, and Dooku, would know that the Sith fear the Chosen One, hence they tried to kill him. And so in many ways, this would be the turning point for Anakin. Yes, he failed by going after his mother, but he also succeeded in defeating a Sith. And whether Shmi lived or died, it'd be used as a teaching moment. Anakin would now fully understand why Jedi must learn to let go, why they can't have attachments, because they can be used against them. This would also be seen as Anakin's great trial, and afterwards he would be knighted as a Jedi. As for Palpatine, this would also be a bit of a turning point for him. I think fear and doubt would begin to creep in, and he'd accelerate his plans, and the Clone Wars would get started as soon as he feasibly could start them. Now, how would he do that exactly? Start the war, I mean? Well, that's actually a tricky question, because in the real timeline, it's hard to know exactly what his plan was for that. Did he foresee the strange series of events that actually started the Clone Wars? Or was that a lucky and happy little series of coincidences? And though we could certainly discuss all that and speculate about how he might have otherwise started the Clone Wars, which could make for a fun video another time, let's assume he'd use a tactic we know he's fond of. Let's say he'd have himself kidnapped by the Separatists, and then they'd give a list of demands to the Republic, but the Republic would instead order the Jedi to rescue him, and that would be what ultimately triggers the Clone Wars. Now, obviously here, Qui-Gon, Dooku, and Anakin would have nothing to do with the war. They're certainly not becoming Jedi generals. Anakin might want to participate, but I think he would be prohibited. They'd likely do all they could then to appeal to the Council to not be a part of this either, that it's gotta be a trap of some kind. But what else can the Jedi do but fight? They can't just abandon the Republic, not to mention they did have a hand in starting the war. And even though it was the Republic who originally demanded they take action to save the Chancellor, as the war rages on, that little detail would be forgotten more and more by those who are sick of the war the Jedi recklessly started, or so they now feel. Public opinion of the Jedi would slowly but surely shift, which is something that certainly seemed to happen in the real timeline. And all of this leads to the biggest, toughest, and dare I say, oddest question of all, which is, did the Jedi of the prequel era need to be destroyed for there to be balance? Which is something I've heard many argue and is something I've pondered myself. Was it part of the Force's plan or design to see almost all of the Jedi of this era be wiped out? I mean, though when the Jedi are acting as they should and existing to serve only the will of the Force and keep balance, they do not, of course, cause imbalance, no matter how many there might be. But what about when so many exist and they're not doing that? And this is obviously a very complex and tricky question, and it has to be kept in mind that I don't believe the Force to be sentient or that it actually thinks and plots and plans things out per se. I've argued before it acts, probably for a lack of a better way of putting it, almost instinctively, or that it has an innate desire to be in a balanced state, and it will try to do what it can or must to achieve that, and that when the Jedi hear the will of the Force, they're again mainly following their instincts, and those instincts align with a balanced force, if you will. Anyway, only distinguishing between what is helping the balance and what is causing imbalance, and not actually or necessarily even seeing things as good or evil, it could be that the Force sees the Jedi as a sort of threat or nuisance that must be dealt with in some capacity. However, one thing to be kept in mind here is that the Jedi do not have evil or ill intent. Almost all of them do want to do what is right, to keep the peace, and to see balance brought or maintained. They've just forgotten that last part there is, or should be, their priority, or that they're no longer going about it in the right way, which is to again simply listen to the will of the Force, or to trust their instincts over stringently following the Jedi Code. Basically what I'm saying here in a roundabout way is that the Jedi's intentions are certainly good, but that the Force likely doesn't see intent. It only sees what is or isn't a hindrance, and will attempt to deal with or correct a problem. And since the Jedi of this time are losing their power, or their ability to use the Force, it's clear the Force is, I guess you could say, unhappy with them, and since, unlike the Sith, the Jedi gain their strength through aligning with the Force instead of bending it to their will, this is causing them to lose their power. Now, this alone might be the plan from the Force to deal with the Jedi, to depower them essentially until they hopefully realign with the will of the Force and act as they should. Either way, I certainly don't think the Jedi need to be destroyed, though they certainly needed to learn or be taught some sort of lesson here, and maybe the hard way. And I think in the long run, they would have learned that lesson from the Clone Wars. I think they would have essentially realized how badly they had lost their way. And so, how I think this plays out in the end is that, as seen in the real timeline basically, the Jedi become increasingly suspicious of Palpatine until the point where they confront him. And I think Palpatine's plan all along has always been to push the Jedi as much as he could to cause them to snap and act so that he can paint them as villains. And so something similar to what we actually see happens again. Several Jedi go to arrest Palpatine, but this time maybe they don't know or haven't figured out that he is the Sith Lord. Either way, the attempt fails, and it again gets portrayed as some type of assassination attempt that Palpatine manages to survive. Order 66 then happens, and again, a good deal of the Jedi are taken out. Immediately after this, in the name of peace and security, Palpatine declares himself Emperor, and his apprentice and a large detachment of perhaps specialized clones are sent to take out Anakin, Dooku, and Qui-Gon, the only obstacles in his way, but they of course fail that mission. Qui-Gon and Anakin then go and confront Palpatine, and try to do it in a public setting, or in a way so that Palpatine is forced to be seen defending himself as a Sith Lord, so that his secret is exposed and that the Jedi Order, or what's left of it, can be vindicated. Qui-Gon is then killed in this encounter, becoming a Force ghost in the process, and Anakin, empowered by the Force perhaps, or by Qui-Gon after his death, who has become more powerful than you can possibly imagine, manages to defeat and kill Palpatine, who everyone now sees was a Sith Lord, and that who was behind everything on both sides the whole time. In the chaos that then ensues, it's Dooku that's able to bring together the Republic, the Separatists, and what's left of the Jedi Order to broker peace. He even becomes interim chancellor for a time. And because of this whole ordeal, in the long run, the reunified Republic is stronger than ever. The Jedi too, pushed to the brink of extinction, now see the error of their ways and begin to retrain themselves in the old ways of the Jedi, when the code was not as important as simply being mindful and following the will of the Force. And any doubts they have about this way, or Qui-Gon's way being correct, are erased because he can and does come back as a Force ghost to help train them. As for what becomes of Anakin, well, perhaps he goes on to one day become Grand Master of the Jedi Order, or perhaps it's at this point that he reunites with Padme, leaves the Order, and spends the rest of his life with her in peace. Either way, I think the purpose of the Chosen One was always to simply destroy the Sith, and maybe to also show the Jedi the error of their ways, without having to destroy them, though again, that's certainly a debatable topic for another time. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me how you think things were meant to go. Am I way off here, close to the mark, or do you think this all sounds pretty reasonable? Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, Thanks for watching.